If you love thrilling real-life stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss an incredible story like this one. The morning sun casts long shadows across the marble courtyard of the royal palace of Valdoria, a small but wealthy European nation nestled between larger countries. The palace stood as a symbol of centuries of tradition, its walls holding secrets of kings and queens who had ruled for generations. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, everything seemed peaceful. Tourists lined up outside the Golden Gates, cameras ready to capture the changing of the guard. Inside, staff members went about their daily routines. Preparing for another day of diplomatic meetings and royal ceremonies, Michael Carter stood near the west entrance, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite being indoors. To anyone watching, he looked like just another member of the security detail, but Michael was far from ordinary palace security. He was a CIA agent who had been working undercover for 3 months, embedded within the palace walls on a classified mission. His assignment was simple on paper, but complex in execution. Intelligence reports suggested that someone within the palace was selling sensitive information to foreign operatives. Information that could compromise not just Valdoria's security, but also American interests in the region. Michael had spent weeks building his cover, learning the routines of the palace, memorizing faces, and establishing trust with the staff. He wore the same dark suit as the other security personnel, carried the same equipment, and followed the same protocols. Nobody suspected that the quiet American guard was actually gathering intelligence for the United States government. His handler back in Washington received weekly reports, but so far, Michael had found nothing concrete. The suspected mole remained hidden, and time was running out. On the other side of the palace, Captain Henrik Larsson prepared for his shift as commander of the Royal Guard. Henrik was 32 years old, a decorated military officer who had served his country with distinction. Being chosen to lead the Royal Guard was the highest honor a soldier could receive in Valdoria. Henrik took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously, according to some of his colleagues. He had joined the military at 18, following in his father's footsteps, and had quickly risen through the ranks due to his dedication and sharp instincts. His wife Maria often joked that he loved the palace more than he loved being home. Although she said it with pride rather than resentment. Henrik's morning routine never changed. He arrived 2 hours before his official shift began, inspected every guard post, checked all security protocols, and reviewed the day's schedule. Today was particularly important because the king would be meeting with foreign dignitaries to discuss a new trade agreement. Security had to be flawless. As Henrik walked through the eastern corridor, checking each guard's position, he noticed something that made him pause. One of the guards near the west entrance seemed out of place, not in appearance but in behavior. The man's posture was too casual, his attention focused on something other than his assigned post. Michael had received an urgent message through his encrypted device just minutes earlier. His handler had new information. The mole was planning to pass documents to a foreign contact today, somewhere inside the palace, during the diplomatic meeting. Michael needed to identify the exchange point and catch both parties in the act. The message added pressure to an already tense situation. He moved through the corridor, trying to appear natural while scanning for anything suspicious. His training had prepared him for moments like this, but the palace environment was challenging. There were too many people, too many rooms, too many places where a quick handoff could occur unnoticed. As the morning progressed, the palace filled with activity. Diplomats arrived in expensive cars, their assistants carrying briefcases and documents. Kitchen staff rushed to prepare an elaborate lunch. Cleaners polished already spotless floors. In the middle of this controlled chaos, Michael spotted his target. A junior minister named Klaus Richter walked toward a restricted section of the palace, looking over his shoulder nervously. Intelligence reports had mentioned Richter as a possible suspect, and now his behavior confirmed those suspicions. Michael's pulse quickened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Henrik noticed the same thing from a different angle. He saw one of the security guards, the American who had joined 3 months ago, following Minister Richter with unusual intensity. Henrik's instincts kicked in immediately. Something was wrong. In his years protecting the royal family, He had learned to trust his gut. And right now, every alarm in his head was ringing. He began moving toward the corridor where both men had disappeared, his hand instinctively moving closer to his weapon. He had no idea that his decision to investigate would trigger a chain of events that would change everything. Michael followed Richter down a narrow hallway that led to the archive rooms, areas that were off-limits to most palace personnel. He stayed back far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to see where Richter was going. The minister stopped at a door, looked around once more, then slipped inside. Michael knew he had seconds to decide. He could call for backup, but that might alert the foreign contact. He could wait and observe, but the exchange might happen and end before he could gather evidence. Or he could confront Richter now and risk blowing his entire operation. The weight of 3 months of undercover work pressed down on him as he reached for the door handle, unaware that Captain Henrik Larsson was now standing just 20 feet behind him, watching his every move. Henrik's military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and act decisively. The American Guard was behaving suspiciously, following a government minister into a restricted area without authorization. In Henrik's mind, the possibilities were clear. Either this guard was involved in something criminal, or he had gone rogue. Neither option was acceptable. Henrik's responsibility was to protect everyone in the palace, including ministers and diplomats. He could not allow an unknown threat to continue unchecked. Michael pushed the door open slowly, his right hand moving to his concealed weapon. The archive room was dimly lit, filled with rows of filing cabinets and old documents that chronicled centuries of royal history. Minister Richter stood near the back corner, speaking in hushed tones to another man Michael did not recognize. The stranger wore civilian clothes and carried a leather messenger bag. This was it. This was the exchange Michael had been hunting for months. He stepped fully into the room, his eyes adjusting to the low light, his mind calculating the best approach. Behind him, Henrik moved with the silence of a trained soldier. He had called for backup using his radio, speaking in codes that would alert other guards without causing palace-wide panic. 2 more guards were already moving toward his position. Henrik's hand rested on his service weapon as he approached the archive room door. He could hear voices inside, low and urgent. Whatever was happening in that room needed to stop immediately. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open with authority, his presence filling the doorway. The moment Henrik entered, everything happened at once. Minister Richter turned pale, his eyes wide with shock. The stranger with the messenger bag reached inside his jacket. Michael, caught between his target and this unexpected interruption, made a split-second decision that would haunt him for years. He drew his weapon and pointed it at Henrik, shouting in English for everyone to freeze. In Michael's mind, he was protecting his operation and preventing a security guard from interfering with the capture of a traitor. In Henrik's mind, his worst fears were confirmed. An armed intruder was threatening a government minister. Henrik's training took over instantly. He drew his own weapon with practiced speed, aiming directly at Michael's chest. The room became a frozen tableau of tension. 2 armed men facing each other, both convinced they were doing the right thing, both one trigger pull away from disaster. Richter pressed himself against the wall, his hands raised, stammering something incomprehensible. The stranger dropped his messenger bag and also raised his hands. Sensing that any movement might end badly for everyone, Michael's mind raced through options. He could not explain who he really was without compromising his identity and potentially alerting the mole network that the CIA was investigating. He could not lower his weapon because Henrik would immediately detain him. He could not shoot a palace guard without creating an international incident that would destroy his career and damage relations between the United States and Valdoria, yet he also could not let Richter and his contact escape with classified documents Henrik saw. Determination in the American's eyes, but also something else. Confusion maybe, or calculation. This was not the look of a simple criminal or a terrorist. Henrik had faced enough dangerous situations to recognize when someone was thinking rather than simply reacting with violence. He kept his weapon steady, his voice calm but firm as he spoke in English. He ordered Michael to drop his weapon and surrender immediately. He explained that backup was already coming, that resistance was futile, and that this situation could still end without bloodshed. The stranger near the filing cabinet made his move during this tense exchange. He grabbed his messenger bag and bolted toward a side door that led to another corridor. Michael's instincts screamed at him to pursue, but he could not turn his back on an armed royal guard. Henrik noticed the movement in his peripheral vision and had to make an impossible choice. Stop the fleeing man or keep the armed guard in front of him contained? He chose containment, trusting that other guards in the palace would intercept the runner. Minister Richter, seeing an opportunity in the chaos, also tried to slip away. He moved along the wall toward the main door, his expensive shoes making soft sounds on the stone floor. Michael shouted at him to stop, swinging his weapon briefly in Richter's direction. That momentary shift in attention was all Henrik needed. He rushed forward with surprising speed, using a combat technique designed to disarm opponents at close range. His shoulder connected with Michael's chest, knocking the air from his lungs and sending both men crashing into a filing cabinet. The impact echoed through the archive room like thunder. Documents flew into the air, cascading down like paper snow. Michael's weapon skittered across the floor, spinning under a desk. Henrik maintained his grip on his own pistol, while using his other arm to pin Michael down. But Michael was no ordinary security guard. His CIA training included advanced hand-to-hand combat. He twisted his body, broke Henrik's hold, and delivered an elbow strike that connected with Henrik's jaw. Henrik's head snapped back, stars exploding in his vision. But he did not let go of his weapon. Outside the archive room, the palace erupted into controlled chaos. Guards rushed through corridors, radios crackling with urgent messages. Someone had triggered the security alert, and within seconds, every entrance and exit of the palace was being locked down. Steel barriers began descending over doorways. Electronic locks engaged with mechanical clicks that echoed through marble halls. The palace, which moments ago had been a place of diplomatic elegance, was transforming into a fortress. No one would enter or leave until the threat was identified and contained. Michael heard the lockdown procedures beginning and knew his situation had just become exponentially worse. He was trapped inside the palace, his cover blown, his target escaping. And he was currently fighting with the captain of the Royal Guard. Years of planning and careful infiltration were collapsing around him. He made one more attempt to explain, gasping out words between struggled breaths, trying to tell Henrik that he was not the enemy. But Henrik had stopped listening. His duty was clear: subdue the threat, protect the palace, ask questions later. 2 more royal guards burst into the archive room, their weapons drawn and ready. They found their captain wrestling with another guard on the floor, surrounded by scattered documents and overturned furniture. The scene looked like a war zone rather than a royal archive. The new arrivals immediately moved to assist Henrik, grabbing Michael's arms and forcing them behind his back. Michael stopped resisting, knowing that fighting 3 trained guards was impossible and would only make his situation worse. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his mind already working on how to salvage this disaster. Henrik stood up slowly, touching his jaw where Michael's elbow had connected. It was already swelling, and he tasted blood in his mouth. He looked down at the American with a mixture of anger and confusion. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. The man had drawn a weapon and threatened people, yet he had not fired. He had fought back when attacked, yet he had not tried to kill anyone. Most criminals or terrorists in a cornered situation would have been far more violent. Henrik's instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through military operations, were telling him there was more to this story. Michael was handcuffed with heavy steel restraints, the kind used for high-risk prisoners. The guards pulled him to his feet roughly, checking him for additional weapons. They found his encrypted communication device, his fake palace identification, and a small collection of surveillance equipment hidden in his uniform pockets. Each discovery made the guards more suspicious, and Henrik more certain that this was bigger than a simple security breach. The American was either a spy or something equally serious. Minister Richter had been caught trying to leave the palace during the UHR down. Guards found him near the south entrance, sweating and nervous, claiming he had an important appointment in the city. His protests fell on deaf ears. Everyone inside the palace was now considered a potential suspect or witness. Richter was escorted to a secure room for questioning, his political status offering him comfort but not freedom. He kept asking for his lawyer, his phone, and someone from the Prime Minister's office. The guards ignored his requests and locked the door behind him. The stranger with the messenger. The bag had not been as lucky as Richter. He made it to the eastern corridor before running directly into a squad of palace security, responding to the lockdown alert. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The palace was sealed tighter than a bank vault. Guards tackled him to the ground, and when they searched his bag, they found what Michael had been looking for. Copies of classified documents, USB drives containing encrypted files, a diplomatic passport from a country known for intelligence operations against Western nations. The stranger refused to speak, invoking diplomatic immunity and demanding to contact his embassy. In the palace security center, monitors showed every corridor, every room, every corner of the massive building. The head of palace security, Commander Stefan Volkov, watched the feeds with growing concern. He was a veteran of both military and intelligence work, having served Valdoria for over 30 years. He had seen attempted assassinations, terrorist threats, and diplomatic incidents, but this situation felt different. 3 people detained, classified documents recovered, and an American guard who was clearly not what he seemed. Volkov picked up a secure phone line and made a call that would escalate this incident to the highest levels of government. Michael was taken to a detention room in the basement of the palace, a place few people knew existed. The room was designed for exactly this type of situation, soundproof and secure, with cameras recording everything. The guards chained him to a metal chair bolted to the floor, then left him alone with Henrik. The captain stood near the door, arms crossed, studying his prisoner carefully. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The silence was heavy with tension and unasked questions. Finally, Henrik broke the silence. He asked Michael directly who he was and what he was doing in the palace. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. Michael looked at the cameras in the corners of the room and then back at Henrik. He knew that whatever he said would be recorded, analyzed, and potentially used against him. His CIA training covered this scenario. Deny everything, request legal representation, and wait for diplomatic channels to resolve the situation. But something in Henrik's eyes made Michael reconsider the standard protocol. Michael made a calculated decision. He told Henrik that he needed to speak with the American ambassador immediately. He explained that this was a matter of international security and that detaining him was a mistake that could have serious consequences. He did not admit to being CIA, but he hinted strongly that he was operating under official capacity. Henrik listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Michael finished, Henrik simply nodded and left the room without a word. Outside the detention area, the palace was in organized chaos. Diplomats who had been attending the meeting were confined to the grand hall, given refreshments and apologies, but not allowed to leave. They made phone calls to their embassies, filing complaints and demanding explanations. Staff members were interviewed one by one about anything suspicious they might have seen. The king had been moved to a secure location within the palace, protected by additional guards, while the situation was assessed and resolved. Commander. Volkov reviewed the evidence collected from the stranger's messenger bag. The documents were definitely classified, containing information about military installations, intelligence operations, and diplomatic communications. This was espionage, pure and simple. Someone had stolen these documents from secure government files and was attempting to sell them to a foreign power. The question was whether the American Guard was part of the theft or trying to stop it. Volkov's decades of experience told him it was probably the latter. But he needed proof. Henrik returned with news that changed everything. The American embassy had been contacted, and they were sending someone immediately. However, they had also sent a priority message through diplomatic channels. The message was brief but significant. It confirmed that an American intelligence operative was working in the palace with the knowledge and approval of certain high-ranking Valdoria officials. The message did not name the operative but requested that any American personnel detained during the security incident be treated as allied intelligence assets rather than criminals. This revelation put Henrik in a difficult position. If Michael was indeed an Allied operative, then Henrik had just assaulted and detained someone who was on their side. But if this was a cover story to protect a real spy, then releasing Michael would be a catastrophic mistake. Henrik needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it quickly. The diplomatic pressure was building, and soon this would be out of his hands entirely. He returned to the detention room, looking at Michael with new understanding, but also continued suspicion. Michael saw the change in Henrik's expression and knew that someone had made contact. Relief washed over him, though he was careful not to show it too clearly. He was not out of danger yet. Palace security could still charge him with assault, weapons violations, and a dozen other offenses. His career might survive this, but it would be damaged. More importantly, the investigation he had worked on for months was now compromised. Richter and his contact were in custody, but the network might extend further than just those two. Other moles might be warned and disappear before they could be caught. Henrik pulled up a chair and sat down across from Michael, the metal legs scraping against the concrete floor. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, asking Michael to explain everything from the beginning. No more games, no more secrets. If they were going to resolve this mess, they needed to trust each other. Michael hesitated, weighing his options one final time, then decided that cooperation was his only real path forward. He began talking, choosing his words carefully, revealing enough to establish credibility. Without compromising operational security, Michael explained that he was a CIA officer, assigned to investigate intelligence leaks coming from the palace. He described how sensitive information had been appearing in foreign intelligence reports for over a year. Information that could only have come from someone with high-level access to Valdoria's government systems. His mission was to identify the source, document the espionage network, and help Valdoria's security services shut it down. He had been working with a small group of trusted officials who had requested American assistance. Though he could not name them without proper authorization, Henrik listened intently, his trained mind processing every detail. The story made sense and explained many things that had seemed odd over the past few months. The American guard who kept irregular hours, who had access to areas beyond his supposed security clearance, who seemed too interested in government officials. Henrik felt a mixture of emotions: anger at not being informed about an intelligence operation in his own palace, respect for the dedication Michael had shown to his mission, and embarrassment at having physically attacked an Allied agent who was trying to protect Valdoria's interests. Commander Volkov entered the room, followed by two men in expensive suits. One was from the American embassy, senior intelligence liaison, whose presence confirmed that Michael was indeed who he claimed to be. The other was a high-ranking official from Valdoria's internal security service. Someone with the authority to make decisions about how this situation would be handled. The room suddenly felt very crowded and very tense. The American diplomat immediately demanded Michael's release, citing intelligence sharing agreements and diplomatic protocols. The Valdoria official held up his hand, asking everyone to calm down and sit. What followed was an hour of intense but professional negotiation. Michael was released from his restraints, but asked to remain in the room. Henrik was questioned about his actions and confirmed that he had been following standard security procedures when confronting an armed individual in a restricted area. The documents recovered from the stranger were examined by the Valdoria official, who became increasingly grave as he reviewed their contents. This was worse than anyone had suspected. The leak had compromised multiple operations and put intelligence assets at risk. Minister Richter was brought in for interrogation by professional intelligence officers. He initially maintained his innocence, claiming he had stumbled into the archive room by accident and had no idea who the stranger was. But when confronted with evidence from the documents and testimony from the detained foreign operative, his story began to fall apart. Richter had gambling debts, the investigators discovered. Substantial debts to people who did not accept excuses or delays. He had been approached months ago by someone offering money in exchange for copies of documents he could access through his government position. He had told himself it was not really treason, that the information was not that important, that he would stop after paying off his debts. The confession opened up new leads. Richter provided names of other people involved in the network, including two more government employees who had been passing information. Palace security immediately moved to secure these individuals before they could flee or destroy evidence. The operation expanded beyond the palace walls, involving police and intelligence services across the capital city. By evening, 7 people were in custody, and investigators were tracking down several more suspects who had already left the country. Michael watched these developments with mixed feelings. He was vindicated professionally, and his mission had succeeded beyond initial expectations. The espionage network was being dismantled, and Valdoria's security services were grateful for American assistance. But the cost had been high. His cover was completely blown, 3 months of careful preparation wasted, and he had nearly been killed by a royal guard doing his job. Michael's handler from the CIA arrived that evening, debriefing him thoroughly, beginning the process of extracting him from his compromised position. Henrik received commendation for his quick action during the security breach, though privately he still felt troubled by the entire incident. He had done everything by the book, followed every protocol, yet the situation had still spiraled into chaos. The experience taught him that sometimes the threats you face are not as simple as armed intruders or terrorists. Sometimes the threats are more subtle, more complex, requiring intelligence and judgment rather than just quick reflexes and weapons. He spent the evening writing detailed reports. Knowing that this incident would be studied and analyzed for years to come, the palace remained in lockdown through the night while security teams swept every room, checked every system, and interviewed every person who had been present during the incident. The diplomatic meeting was canceled, with apologies sent to all the foreign representatives. The king was briefed on the situation and expressed both concern about the security breach and gratitude that it had been uncovered before more damage could be done. He personally thanked both Michael and Henrik for their service. Though the meeting was kept strictly confidential, by midnight, investigators had assembled a clear picture of the espionage operation. The network had been active for 18 months, selling information to 3 different foreign intelligence services. The total financial damage was estimated in the millions, and the strategic damage was even greater. Military plans had been compromised, diplomatic strategies exposed, and intelligence sources potentially burned. The operation had been sophisticated, using multiple layers of communication and dead drops to avoid detection. Without Michael's investigation and the chance confrontation in the archive room, the network might have continued operating for years. Michael prepared to leave Valdoria. Packing the few personal belongings he had accumulated during his 3 months undercover, his next assignment was uncertain, but he knew it would not involve long-term infiltration work. His face was now known to too many people, his methods exposed in reports and debriefings. He felt a strange sense of loss, even though the mission had been successful. The palace had become familiar, the routines comfortable, and he had developed respect for the people he had worked alongside. Even if they had not known his true identity, Henrik found Michael in the security office late that night, both men exhausted but unable to sleep. They talked for over an hour, not about the incident, but about their lives, their careers, and their families. Henrik learned that Michael had a daughter back in Virginia who was about the same age as Henrik's son. Michael learned that Henrik had dreamed of being an architect before his father, convinced him that military service was the family tradition. They discovered they had both served in similar military operations years ago. It's probably in the same region, though, at different times. By the end of the conversation, they had developed a mutual respect that transcended the chaos of their first meeting. The morning after the incident brought a different kind of chaos to the palace. News media had gotten wind that something significant had happened, though official statements remained vague, citing only a security exercise that required temporary lockdown procedures. Reporters gathered outside the palace gates, cameras ready, shouting questions at anyone who came near. Inside, officials worked frantically to control the narrative while investigators continued their work of dismantling the espionage network. The balance between transparency and security had never been more delicate. Michael attended a series of meetings with Valdoria's intelligence leadership and his own CIA supervisors who had flown in overnight. The meetings were professional but tense. Everyone agreed the operation had been successful, but there were uncomfortable questions about coordination and communication. Why had palace security not been fully briefed about the CIA presence? Why had the CIA not informed more people about their investigation? Could the confrontation between Michael and Henrik have been avoided with better information sharing? These were questions without easy answers, and they revealed gaps in the intelligence partnership that needed to be addressed. Henrik faced his own difficult conversations. Some officials questioned why he had physically engaged with someone who turned out to be an Allied agent. Others praised his quick response to what appeared to be a genuine threat. The palace security protocols were being reviewed and updated to prevent similar incidents. Henrik participated in these reviews, offering his perspective as someone who had been in the middle of the chaos. He argued strongly that frontline security personnel needed better intelligence briefings, even if that meant sharing classified information more widely than was comfortable for intelligence agencies. The investigation into Minister Richter and his associates revealed a web of compromise and corruption that shocked even experienced intelligence officers. Richter had not been the only government official with financial problems that made him vulnerable to recruitment. The Foreign Intelligence Service running the operation had specifically targeted individuals with gambling debts, medical expenses, or other financial pressures. They had been patient, building relationships over months before making their pitch. Once someone agreed to provide even minor information, they were trapped. Each document shared gave the Foreign Service leverage to demand more. The stranger caught with the messenger bag turned out to be a diplomatic courier operating under false credentials. His real identity was revealed through fingerprint analysis and cooperation with international law enforcement. He had been moving between 3 European countries, collecting intelligence from various sources and delivering it to handlers in his home country. His arrest was a significant blow to the foreign intelligence operation, though officials knew that someone else would eventually take his place. Intelligence work was like fighting a many-headed monster. Cut off one head, and 2 more would grow back. Michael's extraction from Valdoria was handled quietly but officially. He met with the king one final time in a private ceremony, where his service was acknowledged with words that would never be recorded in any public document. The king presented him with a small medal, not the kind worn publicly, but the kind kept in a drawer as a personal reminder of service rendered. Michael was touched by the gesture, knowing that few people would ever know about his months of work or the risks he had taken. Intelligence work was often thankless, conducted in shadows, recognized only by the handful of people who understood what was at stake. Henrik arranged for a private dinner with Michael on his last night in the country. They met at a quiet restaurant far from the palace and the diplomatic quarter, a place where they could talk without being overheard or photographed. They shared a meal and several drinks, swapping stories that had nothing to do with espionage or security. Henrik talked about his childhood in northern Valdoria, growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. Michael described growing up in suburban America as the youngest of 4 brothers, always competing for attention and approval. As the evening progressed, their conversation turned more serious. Henrik admitted that the incident had shaken his confidence. He had always believed that following procedures and training would be enough to handle any situation. Now he understood that some situations were more complex than procedures could address. Sometimes you had to make judgment calls with incomplete information. Sometimes those calls would be wrong no matter how carefully you made them. Michael shared his own doubts. He had succeeded in his mission, but wondered if the methods had been worth the cost. Going undercover meant lying to good people, manipulating trust, and living a false life for months. It was effective, but morally exhausting. They discussed what would happen next for both of them. Michael's career would continue, though probably in a different capacity. His days of long-term undercover work were likely over. He might move into training new agents, teaching them the lessons he had learned through experience. Or he might transition to analytical work, using his field experience to better understand intelligence reports and agent communications. Henrik's future was more certain, but also changing. He would remain with the Royal Guard, but with new responsibilities for liaison with intelligence services. His experience during the incident had shown his superiors that he could handle complex situations that crossed the boundary between security and intelligence work. Before they parted that night, Henrik asked Michael a question that had been bothering him since the incident. What would have happened if Henrik had shot first? If he had seen Michael as an immediate deadly threat and reacted with lethal force? Michael was quiet for a long moment before answering. He admitted that the thought had kept him awake at night. He had pointed a weapon at a man who was just doing his job protecting people. If Henrik had fired, it would have been legally and morally justified. Michael would have been dead, and Henrik would have spent the rest of his life knowing he had killed an Allied agent. The randomness of that outcome, how one moment of hesitation had saved both their lives, was sobering. Henrik shared his own perspective. In that moment, in the archive room, he had come within a fraction of a second of pulling the trigger. Only his training and experience had given him the patience to assess the situation for another heartbeat. He had seen something in Michael's eyes. Some indication that this was not a terrorist or assassin, but someone operating under different rules. If he had been less experienced, if he had panicked, everything would have ended differently. They both understood how close they had come to a tragedy that would have accomplished nothing, except creating two families with empty chairs at their dinner tables. The next morning, Michael left Valdoria on a commercial flight. Traveling under his real name for the first time in months, Henrik came to the airport to see him off, a gesture that was partly personal and partly professional courtesy. They shook hands at the security checkpoint, neither man particularly comfortable with emotional displays, both understanding that they had shared something significant. They exchanged contact information, though both suspected they would probably never use it. Their worlds were too different, their lives taking them in separate directions. As Michael's plane took off, he looked down at the city below. The palace visible in the distance, with its distinctive architecture and sprawling grounds. He thought about the people still down there dealing with the aftermath of the investigation. The careers that would be ruined, and the families that would be torn apart by the espionage scandal. Intelligence work always had collateral damage. People caught in the machinery of national security who never intended to be part of international intrigue. Richter would spend years in prison, his family bearing the shame of his choices. The other compromised officials would face similar fates. Even the palace staff who had done nothing wrong would live under suspicion for months, while investigators verified their loyalty. 3 months after the incident, life at the royal palace of Valdoria had returned to something resembling normal, though the scars remained visible to those who knew where to look. New security protocols had been implemented, requiring more extensive background checks for all personnel and regular security briefings that included intelligence updates. The archive room where Michael and Henrik had their confrontation was now under additional surveillance, with restricted access requiring approval from multiple supervisors. The palace had learned its lessons, adapting to threats that came not from outside invaders, but from trusted insiders who had betrayed their positions. Henrik continued his role as captain of the Royal Guard, but his responsibilities had expanded significantly. He now attended regular meetings with Valdoria's intelligence services, providing security perspectives on information being gathered about potential threats. The experience with Michael had changed how he approached his work. He was less rigid about following procedures without question and more willing to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. His superiors noticed the change and appreciated it. Henrik had evolved from an excellent security officer into something more valuable, someone who could think strategically about threats that were not obvious or immediate. The espionage network that Michael had helped uncover continued to reveal its scope even months later. International cooperation between intelligence services led to arrests in 4 other countries. The Foreign Intelligence Service running the operation suffered a significant setback, losing not just their sources in Valdoria, but also several officers who had been running the network. Digital forensics experts analyzed the encrypted files recovered from the courier's messenger bag, discovering communications that pointed to other ongoing operations. The investigation had become one of the largest counterintelligence successes in recent European history. Michael had been reassigned to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, working in the training division, as he had suspected. He spent his days teaching new agents about undercover operations, sharing lessons learned from his years in the field. He was careful to use the Valdoria incident as a teaching example, emphasizing the importance of coordination with local security forces and the dangers of operating in isolation. His students listened with fascination to the story of how a 3-month operation nearly ended in disaster. Because of a single moment of miscommunication, Michael never mentioned names or specific locations in his lectures, keeping the details classified. But the lessons were clear enough. His daughter Sarah had been thrilled to have him home permanently, or at least as permanently as CIA work allowed. She was 13 now, entering that difficult teenage phase where she was both embarrassed by her father and desperate for his attention. Michael tried to be present for her school events and weekend activities, though he could never fully explain where he had been or what he had done during his absences. She knew he worked for the government in some capacity that required security clearances and occasional travel. That was enough for now. Though Michael wondered what he would tell her when she was older and started asking harder questions, Henrik's life had also settled into a new pattern. His wife Maria had been initially angry when she learned the full story of what had happened during the lockdown. Angry that he had been in danger without her knowing. Angry that he continued choosing a career that put him at risk. But her anger had softened into acceptance. The way it always did with military families who understood that service sometimes required sacrifice. They had long conversations about the future, about whether Henrik should consider retiring from active security work and moving into an administrative position. Henrik was not ready for that yet. But he acknowledged the day would come when someone younger and faster would need to take his place, protecting the palace. The diplomatic relationship between the United States and Valdoria had actually strengthened as a result of the incident. The successful cooperation in uncovering the espionage network demonstrated the value of intelligence sharing and joint operations. New agreements were signed, creating formal channels for American and Valdoria intelligence services to work together more effectively. Some of these agreements directly addressed the gaps that had nearly led to tragedy in the palace archive room. Future operations would include better coordination with local security forces and clearer lines of communication. Minister Richter was sentenced to 15 years in prison for espionage and treason. His trial had been kept as quiet as possible to avoid embarrassing the government, but details inevitably leaked to the press. Richter's family suffered enormously from the scandal. His wife divorced him before the trial even ended. His children changed their last names to escape the association with their father's crimes. In prison, Richter reportedly spent his time reading and reflecting on the choices that had destroyed his life. He had cooperated fully with investigators, providing information that helped dismantle the entire network. But that cooperation could not undo the damage he had caused or restore what he had lost. 1 year after the incident, Henrik received an unexpected letter forwarded through official channels. It was from Michael, writing to check in and share news of his life. The letter was carefully worded to avoid any classified information, just personal updates and reflections on how the experience had affected him. Michael mentioned his daughter's interest in international relations, inspired partly by his vague descriptions of his work. He talked about his new role training agents, and how satisfying it was to pass on knowledge to the next generation. He closed the letter by thanking Henrik for his professionalism during the incident, expressing hope that they might meet again under better circumstances. Henrik wrote back, surprising himself with how much he had to say. He described the changes at the palace, the new security measures, and his expanded responsibilities. He mentioned his son's recent achievement in school and Maria's new job at a local hospital. He also shared something more personal, admitting that the incident had changed how he viewed his work and his life. He had spent years being the perfect soldier, following orders and executing procedures with mechanical precision. The confrontation with Michael had reminded him that life was more complicated than procedures, that sometimes the right choice was not the obvious one, and that human judgment mattered as much as training. Their correspondence continued sporadically over the following months, each letter revealing a bit more about their lives and thoughts. They discovered they had similar views on many topics, from politics to parenting to the challenges of maintaining relationships while working in demanding careers. The letters became something both men looked forward to, connection to someone who understood a shared experience that few others could comprehend. They joked about writing a book together someday, though they both knew that the classified nature of their encounter would keep it secret for decades. 2 years after the incident, Michael was promoted to a senior position in the CIA's European Operations Division. The promotion came with an assignment to establish better coordination protocols with Allied intelligence services, essentially formalizing the lessons learned from the Valdoria operation. His first official visit in the new role was to Valdoria, where he would meet with security officials to discuss enhanced cooperation. Henrik was assigned to be his liaison during the visit, providing security and facilitating meetings with key officials. Their reunion at the airport was warm but professional. Conscious of the many eyes watching and the official nature of the visit, Henrik drove Michael to his hotel. During the 20-minute drive, they caught up on news that had not made it into their letters. Michael's daughter was now thinking about following in his footsteps, considering a career in intelligence or foreign service. Henrik's son had decided he wanted to be a doctor, breaking the family tradition of military service. Henrik admitted he was relieved, hoping his son could have a safer and less complicated career than his father had chosen. The official meetings went smoothly, with both American and Valdoria officials praising the improved cooperation that had developed since the espionage network was dismantled. New procedures were signed into effect, creating formal mechanisms for intelligence sharing and coordinated operations. Michael presented a detailed report on lessons learned from the incident, carefully avoiding any criticism of Valdoria security while highlighting areas where better communication would have prevented the dangerous confrontation. Henrik contributed from the security perspective, explaining how frontline officers needed better intelligence briefings to make informed decisions in crisis situations. On Michael's last evening in Valdoria, he and Henrik returned to the same restaurant where they had dined 2 years earlier. The owner recognized Henrik and gave them the same quiet table in the back corner. They ordered the same dishes and similar drinks, falling into easy conversation that mixed professional topics with personal stories. Michael talked about the challenges of his new position, politics of coordinating between different agencies and countries, and the frustration of dealing with bureaucracy. Henrik described his own struggles with organizational change, implementing new security protocols while maintaining the traditions that made the Royal Guard special. As the evening grew late and the restaurant began to empty, their conversation turned philosophical. They discussed the nature of loyalty, duty, and sacrifice. Both men had dedicated their lives to serving their countries, accepting risks and hardships that most people never experienced. They had missed important moments with their families, carried secrets that isolated them from friends, and made choices that haunted them in quiet moments. Yet neither regretted their path. The work mattered, protecting people who would never know they were in danger, maintaining stability in a chaotic world, and standing against those who would use information and influence for destructive purposes. Henrik asked Michael if he ever thought about that moment in the archive room when they had pointed weapons at each other, both convinced they were doing the right thing. Michael admitted he thought about it often, sometimes waking from dreams where the outcome had been different. Henrik confessed the same, adding that the experience had taught him humility. He had been so certain of himself in that moment, so confident in his assessment of the threat, that he had been completely wrong about who Michael was and what he was doing. That uncertainty now informed everything he did, making him more thoughtful, but also more effective. They parted as friends this time, not just professional acquaintances bound by a shared incident. Michael promised to visit again when circumstances allowed, and Henrik invited him to bring his daughter next time. She could see the palace properly as a guest, rather than through her father's covert observations. They exchanged personal phone numbers, no longer restricted to official channels and carefully worded letters. As Michael's taxi pulled away from the restaurant, Henrik stood on the sidewalk watching until the taillights disappeared around a corner. The story of what happened in the royal palace of Valdoria remained classified, known only to a select few officials and the people directly involved. No medals were publicly awarded, no press releases celebrated the successful counterintelligence operation, and no monuments commemorated the moment when a CIA agent and a royal guard nearly killed each other before becoming allies. But in training sessions at CIA headquarters and security briefings at the palace, the incident lived on as a powerful lesson about communication, trust, and the complicated nature of modern security work. Sometimes the greatest threats come from unexpected directions. Sometimes the people pointing guns at you are actually on your side. The challenge is knowing the difference before it is too late.